The room was full of people. The cameras were recording. The light erased everything. And that's when she died. This is a murder no one saw, because everyone was looking. Prologue. The white space. The room had no corners. That was the first thing people noticed, even if they didn't know how to articulate it. The walls curved seamlessly into the floor rose gently into the ceiling, and every boundary dissolved into the same flawless white surface. No edges, no shadows, no reference points. A space designed to feel infinite, a space designed to erase distance. The photoshoot had been running for hours. Lights hummed softly. Assistants moved in rehearsed paths, careful not to interrupt the choreography of production. Stylists adjusted fabric with surgical precision. Cameras clicked in disciplined bursts, synchronized with commands that floated through the air like ritual phrases. Hold. Again. Perfect. The model stood at the center of it all. Her name was Lina Moreau. She was tall, composed, and professionally distant from her own body. That, Edward Hale would later learn, was part of the job. Models learned early not to inhabit themselves too deeply. Pain, hunger, exhaustion, all of it was noise to be filtered out. White light washed over her from every direction. She did not cast a shadow. Dozens of people were present. The photographer, 2 assistants, lighting technicians, creative directors, makeup artists, a producer pacing just outside the frame. Every angle was covered. Every second was recorded. Nothing about this moment suggested danger. "Ready," someone said. The lights intensified. This was the look they wanted, overexposed, immaculate, unreal. A body floating in brightness, untethered from environment or gravity. The camera settings were adjusted accordingly. High exposure, minimal contrast. The image would be perfect. The space would disappear. Now, the flashes went off. Not 1, not 2. A sequence, rapid, overlapping, blinding. For less than half a second, the entire room ceased to exist as a comprehensible environment. Human vision collapsed inward, overwhelmed by uniform brightness. Depth vanished, motion became suggestion. In that fraction of time, Lina Moreau fell. No one saw it happen. Not because they weren't looking, because they were. The cameras continued firing. The photographer frowned slightly, sensing disruption without identifying it. Someone lowered a light by instinct. Another assistant took a step forward, then hesitated, unsure whether the movement belonged to the shot. "Hold position," a voice said reflexively. The instruction hung in the air. When the flashes stopped, Lina was on the floor. Her body lay at an angle that felt wrong against the perfection of the space. Too still, too heavy. Her hair spread unnaturally across the white surface, creating the first imperfection anyone could point to. Silence followed. Not dramatic, confused. "Is this part of it?" someone asked. No one answered. A stylist approached first, cautious, as if stepping onto a stage during rehearsal. She knelt, touched Lina's arm, and recoiled immediately. "She's cold." That was when the room changed. Emergency services arrived quickly. The lights were turned off, the cameras lowered. The illusion collapsed as brutally as it had been built. The white space, stripped of intention, became just another room. But the footage remained. Hours of it. Angles upon angles, perfect coverage. And not a single frame showed the moment Lina Moreau was struck. Edward Hale watched the raw material late that night. He slowed it, isolated frames, studied exposure values, examined motion blur and lens artifacts. He expected to find something, a hand, a shadow, a distortion. There was nothing, just white. The official explanation formed quickly. A fall, a medical episode. An unfortunate accident amplified by extreme conditions. Edward did not argue. He asked a simpler question. If no one touched her, he said quietly, why did she die exactly in the only moment no one could see? Edward paused the footage at the peak of the flash sequence. For 3 frames, the image was completely overexposed, pure white. Edward wrote a single word in his notebook and circled it. Blindness. Edward Hale closed the file. This was not a case about fashion. It was not a case about beauty. It was a case about perception and the dangerous assumption that seeing everything means missing nothing. Chapter 1. Everyone was watching. Edward Hale began by counting, not suspects, people. 27 individuals had been present in the studio at the time Lina Moreau died. 27 pairs of eyes. 27 accounts that began with the same sentence, spoken with slight variations, but identical confidence. I was looking at her. Edward wrote the sentence once at the top of the page and drew a line beneath it. The fashion house provided a full roster, names, roles, credentials. The production manager walked Edward through the hierarchy as if explaining a machine. Each function had a boundary. Each function had a boundary. No one stepped outside their lane. That mattered. When responsibility was segmented, accountability became diffuse. Edward nodded politely and asked for the floor plan. The studio was a perfect oval, a continuous white surface without seams. The cyclorama curved upward, erasing the distinction between wall and ceiling. Lighting rigs were positioned symmetrically, angled to eliminate shadow and depth. The center point, where Lina had stood, was mathematically equidistant from every light source. Edward stood there now, alone. He closed one eye. Depth flattened instantly. With both eyes open, the effect was worse. The room resisted scale. Distance became guesswork. Edward wrote, "White space removes anchors." Edward interviewed the photographer first, a veteran, award-winning, calm under pressure. "Describe the moment before she fell," Edward said. The photographer didn't hesitate. "She was holding the pose," he said. "Perfect alignment, chin slightly lowered, weight on the back foot." "And your focus?" Edward asked. "On the frame," the photographer replied. "On exposure and symmetry." Edward nodded. "Not on the person." The lighting director spoke next. "We were running a flash cascade, high-frequency bursts, very aggressive." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Why so intense?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Because white eats detail," she said. "If you don't overpower it, you lose the subject." Edward wrote that down. To see white, you must blind it. One by one, Edward spoke to them all. The stylist had been watching fabric movement. The makeup artist had been checking shine. The creative director had been watching posture. The producer had been watching the clock. Everyone had been watching something. No one had been watching everything. Edward reviewed the footage again, this time mapping sight lines. Each camera had a clean view. Each angle overlapped another. No blind spots. On paper, the coverage was absolute. Edward noticed a detail that had been overlooked. At the moment Lina fell, several people reacted, but not in the same direction. One assistant stepped forward. Another stepped back. A third turned toward the photographer, not the model. Edward wrote, "When perception collapses, people look for authority." Edward asked a simple question during the group interview. Who was closest to Lina? The answers varied. "Me," said one assistant. "No, I was," said another. "I was right there," a third insisted. Edward let them speak. Proximity, he knew, was subjective in a space without depth. Edward returned to the phrase again. "I was watching her." He asked the photographer to clarify. "Watching what?" Edward said. The photographer thought. Her line, he said. Her silhouette, the negative space around her. Edward nodded. Negative space. The space where nothing existed. Edward examined Lina's final position. She had not fallen forward or backward. She had collapsed downward, as if something had been removed rather than added. No flailing, no attempt to catch herself. Edward wrote, "The body did not anticipate impact." Edward considered the timing. The fall occurred during the peak of the flash cascade, a window lasting less than half a second, enough time for action, too little time for perception. Edward paused the footage at the exact frame where motion blur swallowed detail. White. Nothing but white. Edward closed the chapter with a realization that reframed the entire case. This was not a murder hidden from view. It was a murder that exploited attention. Everyone had been watching Lina Moreau, but no one had been watching the moment she died. Edward wrote the final line carefully. The crime did not happen in secret. It happened in plain sight, inside the frame everyone trusted. Chapter 2. How White Blinds. Edward Hale did not trust what people believed they saw. He trusted what the human eye was physically incapable of processing. The cyclorama was not neutral, it was aggressive. White, when pushed to perfection, did not reveal truth, it erased it. Edward knew this long before he stepped into the studio, but standing inside the space confirmed it in a way theory never could. White was not empty. White was overwhelming. Edward consulted the lighting charts. Exposure levels had been pushed beyond what was comfortable for prolonged human focus. This was intentional. Fashion photography did not aim for realism, it aimed for abstraction. The body was not meant to be perceived as a body, but as shape, contrast, concept. Edward underlined a line in the technical notes. Overexposure reduces perceived depth. Depth was where danger lived. Edward closed his eyes and reopened them slowly, standing in the center of the cyclorama. For a fraction of a second, nothing resolved. The retina, saturated by uniform brightness, struggled to recalibrate. Edges appeared late, movement registered without context. Edward snapped his fingers in front of his face. The sound grounded him. Vision lagged behind. Edward wrote, "Sight recovers slower than sound." Edward reviewed the medical examiner's preliminary conclusions. Lina Moreau had suffered blunt force trauma consistent with a sudden impact. The injury was precise, localized, not the result of a fall from standing height, not accidental. Edward circled the word precise. Precision required timing. Edward returned to the footage and slowed it again, this time focusing not on Lina, but on the light itself. At peak intensity, the flashes overlapped, multiple strobes fired within milliseconds of each other, creating a continuous field of white rather than discrete bursts. For cameras, this resulted in clipped highlights. For humans, it resulted in temporary photic blindness. Edward knew the term. Flash blindness. Edward spoke with an ophthalmologist later that day. "How long," Edward asked, "does it take for vision to recover after intense overexposure?" "It depends," the doctor replied, "but during peak saturation, anywhere from a few hundred milliseconds to a full second." Edward nodded. "And during that time?" he asked. "Depth perception is compromised. Motion can be detected, but direction and cause are unreliable." Edward wrote, "A second is more than enough." Edward reconstructed the moment again. The flashes began. Vision collapsed. Perception flattened. In that interval, movement would register only as disruption, not as action. Edward marked the window. 0.47 seconds. almost half a second of effective blindness. Edward examined camera behavior next. Cameras did not blink. They recorded continuously, ruthlessly, honestly. But cameras did not interpret. At extreme exposure, detail vanished. The sensors clipped data to pure white. No edges, no shadows, no usable information. Edward wrote, "Cameras do not lie. They simply record nothing." Edward compared frames from different angles. All of them failed at the same instant, not because they were tampered with, because they were overwhelmed. Edward leaned back. The crime did not hide from cameras. It hid inside their limits. Edward considered Lina's posture. She had been balanced, centered, stable, a model trained to hold uncomfortable positions for extended periods without movement. Her muscles were engaged, her awareness external. In that state, even a minimal force, applied suddenly, would not trigger a reflexive response. Edward wrote, "Stillness delays defense." Edward returned to the floor. There were no scuff marks, no signs of sliding. Lina had not tried to step away. She had not reacted. Whatever struck her had done so cleanly, decisively, and within the visual dead zone created by light. Edward circled the phrase, "visual dead zone." Edward closed the chapter with a conclusion that reframed the studio entirely. This was not a place where sight was enhanced. It was a place where sight was weaponized. Edward wrote the final line carefully. "White does not reveal truth. White removes the ability to see it." Chapter 3. The Frame That Lies. Edward Hale did not accuse the cameras. Cameras did exactly what they were built to do. They framed reality. They reduced the world to something manageable, measurable, archivable. In fashion, the frame was not just a technical boundary. It was an agreement between creator and viewer about what mattered. Everything outside it became irrelevant. Edward stood behind the primary camera position and looked through the lens. The white space filled the frame completely. No horizon, no depth cues, no context. The model's body floated in abstraction, detached from gravity, from floor, from consequence. Edward lowered the camera. "This," he said quietly, "is where the lie begins." The production had used 6 cameras, all synchronized, all calibrated to identical exposure values, all positioned to ensure redundancy. The idea was simple. If one missed something, another would catch it. Edward smiled faintly at the optimism. Redundancy only worked when the same limits did not apply to all instruments at once. Edward asked the director of photography to explain the choice. "Consistency," the man said. "You want the images to match, same light, same tone, same look." Edward nodded. "And if that consistency removes detail?" Edward asked. The man hesitated. "That's the aesthetic," he said. Edward wrote, "Aesthetic outranks information." Edward returned to the footage again, this time not watching Lina, but watching the edges of the frame. He noticed something subtle. During the flash cascade, the white space did not just brighten, it expanded. The boundary between subject and background dissolved. Lina's silhouette blurred into the environment, becoming less body than suggestion. Edward paused the frame. At that instant, the image no longer distinguished between foreground and background. Edward wrote, "When everything is white, nothing is in front." Edward considered what the frame excluded. The floor was visible, but only as white plane. The air was visible, but only as brightness. Movement existed, but without vectors. Anything entering the frame during the flash would not register as intrusion. It would register as noise. Edward reconstructed the killer's problem. They did not need invisibility, they needed misclassification. If an action could be interpreted as part of the visual chaos, it would not be questioned. Edward underlined the word interpreted. Edward spoke with a visual cognition specialist. When people view high-exposure images, Edward asked, what do they trust? The frame, the specialist replied without hesitation. They assume it contains all relevant information. And when the frame fails, Edward asked, they blame perception, not the frame. Edward nodded. That was the trick. Edward reviewed the crew's reactions again. When Lina fell, several people looked toward the cameras instinctively, not at the body. Edward wrote, they trusted the frame to explain reality. Edward examined the exact instant of collapse. In one angle, Lina's shoulder dipped slightly before the rest of her body followed. In another, the movement was barely perceptible, a suggestion rather than an event. Edward layered the frames. The action existed only across angles, never fully within one. Edward circled the conclusion. The truth was distributed too thinly to be seen. Edward asked a question that reframed the case. What if the frame was designed not to capture the crime, he said, but to reassure everyone that nothing happened? The room fell quiet. Edward walked the perimeter of the cyclorama. From certain positions, he noticed that depth returned briefly, just outside the primary camera arc, a place where light intensity dropped slightly, a place where shadows tried, unsuccessfully, to exist. Edward stopped. This was where reality leaked back in. Edward closed the chapter with the realization that settled everything into focus. The murder did not exploit a blind spot in the room. It exploited trust in the frame. Edward wrote the final line slowly. The frame does not show the truth. It decides what the truth is allowed to look like. Chapter 4. Who Controlled the Light? Edward Hale stopped looking at Lina Moreau, not because she no longer mattered, but because she no longer explained anything. The question was no longer what happened to her, but who decided when no one could see what was happening. In the hierarchy of the studio, power did not sit where outsiders expected. It was not with the model, not with the photographer, not even with the creative director. Those roles shaped the image. They did not control the conditions under which the image existed. Edward had learned long ago that in any environment, the person who controlled light controlled reality. The lighting console was positioned just outside the cyclorama, shielded from the direct glare of the set. From there, the operator could see everything, not as the audience saw it, but as data, levels, timing, sequences, percentages. Edward stood beside it now. The console log was meticulous. Every flash, every ramp-up, every overlap. Edward traced the sequence backward. The cascade that coincided with Lina's death had not been improvised. It had been planned. Edward spoke with the lighting director again, this time away from the rest of the crew. "You didn't choose the flash pattern," Edward said calmly. The woman shook her head. "No, that came from above." Edward nodded. "Who approved it?" he asked. She hesitated. "The producer, ultimately." Edward wrote the word producer and circled it. The producer's role was logistical on paper: budget, schedule, deliverables. In practice, the producer controlled pressure. They decided when the shoot needed to move faster, when breaks were skipped, when one more take became mandatory, and, crucially, when light was pushed past comfort. Edward reviewed the emails. The language was subtle. "We need something more extreme. The whites aren't clean enough. Push the exposure, we'll fix it in post." Edward underlined the last line. "We'll fix it later" was always dangerous. Edward reconstructed the moment again, now through the producer's lens. The shoot was behind schedule. The client was impatient. The look was not landing. The solution had been escalation. More light, more intensity, more abstraction. Edward wrote, "Escalation creates opportunity." Edward questioned the producer that evening. A composed man, polished, used to scrutiny. "We needed impact. the producer said. "The brand wanted something unforgettable." Edward nodded. "And you approved the cascade," Edward said. "Yes," the producer replied. "It was safe." Edward tilted his head slightly. "Safe for whom?" he asked. The producer frowned. "For everyone," he said. "We've used similar setups before." Edward did not argue. He asked a different question. "Did you consider what the light would do to perception?" Edward asked. The producer paused. "That's not my department," he said. Edward wrote, "Power without understanding." Edward returned to the console logs. One detail stood out. The cascade had been extended by a fraction of a second, less than anyone would consciously notice, more than enough to matter. Edward marked it. An extra 0.12 seconds. The producer had requested it. Edward understood then. The murder did not require precision in force. It required precision in blindness. The killer needed a moment when Lina could not orient herself and no one else could interpret what they saw. That moment had been delivered deliberately. Edward walked the edge of the cyclorama again. He stood where the producer would have been standing during the shoot. From here, the center of the room was an abstract diagram, not a person. Edward wrote, "Distance creates abstraction." Edward closed the chapter with a realization that stripped the glamour from the case entirely. Lina Moreau had not died because the industry was cruel. She had died because someone had decided that visibility could be sacrificed for effect. Edward wrote the final line carefully. "The person who controls the light decides when reality is allowed to exist." Chapter 5. The only moment that didn't exist. Edward Hale reduced the case to time, not motive, not opportunity, not even method. Time. Because if a murder could not be placed cleanly on a timeline, it would be explained away as accident, and this one resisted placement with stubborn elegance. Edward opened the console logs again. He had stared at them for hours already, but now he was no longer looking for anomalies. He was looking for continuity. Every flash was logged, every overlap recorded, every ramp-up precise to the millisecond. There were no gaps, and that was the problem. Edward isolated the cascade, a sequence of high-frequency flashes designed to merge visually into a single continuous wash of light. To the human eye, it registered as brightness. To the camera sensor, it registered as saturation. To time itself, it became ambiguous. Edward wrote a single phrase in the margin. Temporal smearing. Edward reconstructed the second again, not as a second, but as perception. The flashes began. Vision collapsed. Depth vanished. For 0.47 seconds, the room existed only as uniform brightness, not a space, not a volume, just an idea of light. Edward paused. A human action did not need long. It needed placement. Edward examined Lina Moreau's injuries again. The impact had been localized, focused, delivered at an angle inconsistent with collapse. There was no evidence of flailing, no defensive posture, no attempt to regain balance. She had not seen it coming. She had not known it had happened. Edward underlined the medical note. No anticipatory muscle engagement. Edward returned to the studio one last time. The lights were off. The cyclorama had lost its illusion. Corners were visible now, awkward and disappointing. The space looked smaller than memory suggested. Edward stood at the center. He measured distances, from the console to Lina's position, from the edge of the light rig to the center mark, from the producer's vantage point to the blind zone created by the cascade. Edward did not rush. The room surrendered its geometry slowly. Edward replayed the moment in his mind. The cascade peaked. The white field expanded. Perception flattened. In that instant, someone stepped forward, not running, not lunging, just stepping. Edward imagined the movement. A hand, a tool small enough to be mistaken for equipment, a motion aligned with the direction of light, not against it. The strike would not register as violence, it would register as disruption. Edward knew why no one had reacted, because what they saw did not look like cause, it looked like effect. Lina's body dropped, and the mind worked backward, inventing a fall. Edward wrote, "The brain explains what the eye cannot resolve." Edward examined the producer's position again. He had been close enough. He had known the timing. He had approved the extension. But Edward did not accuse him of striking Lina. That would have been too simple. The producer had not needed to strike her. He had needed to make the strike invisible. Edward returned to the final frames. At peak exposure, Lina's silhouette dissolved entirely. For 3 frames, less than 1/10 of a second, there was no subject, just white. Edward circled the timestamp. That was it. The only moment that did not exist. Edward closed the loop. The blow occurred during that non-moment. The body reacted after perception returned. The cause was erased by the frame itself, not hidden, deleted. Edward wrote his conclusion carefully. This was not a murder that escaped cameras. It was a murder that occurred outside of perception while remaining inside recording. Edward knew how that would sound in court. Impossible. He knew how it would sound to anyone who had stood in that room. Obvious. Edward closed his notebook. There was no dramatic confession waiting at the end of this case, no sudden outburst, no single villain stepping forward. There would be liability, negligence, reckless endangerment. But the truth was quieter. Someone had understood exactly how long blindness lasted, and that had been enough. Edward wrote the final line of the chapter slowly. The murder did not happen in time. It happened in the space between moments. Epilogue. Nothing but white. The studio was empty when Edward Hale returned. No lights, no cameras, no people pretending to be necessary. The cyclorama looked smaller without intention behind it. White paint met the floor imperfectly now. Seams visible, curves less convincing. Without purpose, the space had lost its authority. Edward stood where Lina Moreau had stood. Without the lights, depth returned immediately. The room became ordinary, almost disappointing. Edward had seen this before. Places designed to erase reality never survived its absence. The official conclusion would never use the word murder. It would speak of unsafe working conditions, excessive exposure, negligent oversight. There would be fines, settlements, rewritten protocols. No one would be arrested. Edward knew this was inevitable. Crimes without a visible act were always translated into failures of process. Systems preferred to admit error rather than intent. The footage would be archived, analyzed, discussed, debated. Experts would argue about milliseconds and exposure curves. Commentators would insist that if something truly violent had occurred, someone would have noticed. Edward knew better. Violence did not require spectacle. It required opportunity. Edward walked the perimeter of the white room one last time. He imagined the moment again, not the strike, but the decision that made it possible. The choice to value image over perception. The assumption that light was always revealing. Edward wrote one final note in his notebook. The absence of darkness does not mean the presence of truth. Outside, the city moved as usual. Billboards glowed, screens flickered. Faces passed by reflected in glass and polished metal. Everything was visible. Everything was illuminated. Edward paused at the exit and looked back once. White was never neutral. White demanded trust. And trust, Edward knew, was the easiest thing to exploit. Edward Hale disappeared into the evening. Somewhere, another space was being designed, another room without shadows, another promise that nothing could be hidden if everything was seen. And somewhere inside it, a moment would occur that no one could quite remember, because it happened when vision itself failed. She wasn't killed in darkness. She was killed in perfect light. If you want more detective stories where crimes hide inside ordinary systems, subscribe to the channel. The next case will be just as visible.